and welcome all of you to this public lecture series on pathways and paradigms for India's G20 presidency. I'm your host Samina Hamid, and today we'll be deliberating on what is unique about India's presidency of G20. And to tell us all this, nobody could be better placed than Professor Swaran Singh, leading voice on discourses of multilateralism. Professor Swaran Singh is the professor and former chair at Center for International Politics, Organization, Disarmament at School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has an illustrious academic career and association with prestigious global universities and think tanks. He is the president of Association of Asian Scholars, an adjunct fellow at the Char Institute, Beijing, senior fellow at the Institute of National Security Studies, Sri Lanka, visiting professor, Yunnan University of Economics and Finance. Formerly, he has been the visiting professor at Australian National University, Beijing University, Hiroshima University, University of Philippines, and many more. He is a prolific author and often his publications are back to back. His recent publications include Multilateralism in Indo-Pacific, Conceptual and Operational Challenges, Revisiting Gandhi, Legacies for World Peace. Professor Swaran Singh, it's great to have you here. Please join me in welcoming Professor Swaran.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anurag. Till now, India has been the leading voice for global South. Now, India is posturing for global leadership. India's presidency of G20, which is the multilateral organization of leading 20 economies, is premised on the theme One Earth, One Family, One Future. Professor Swaran Singh, give us a sense what is unique about India's presidency and how India can make a difference. Over to you.
Thank you, Samina. And first of all, I must thank you and your team for organizing this fantastic set of talks on G20 on eve of the summit meeting in New Delhi. I must also thank my colleagues. My very dear friend Bajpayee is here, and Rico has come from Japanese mission, students and friends. I am not raising the question whether or not and why India is unique, because I take that as a premise given that all of us are unique, all nations are unique, and therefore that I take as given that India is unique in many ways. But then when it comes to India's presidency of G20, what is it that makes this presidency unique is the question that I want to address today. And I will give you about 15 reasons or so roughly. I hope I can reach 15, I just said 15. And I'll classify these 15 reasons or so into set of determinants that are unique. Second, set of processes and operations which are unique. Then set of outcomes which we all anticipate will be unique. And finally, set of unique limitations that India's presidency has had and will have as the process of G20 meetings continue. All of you, at least most of your schools from School of International Studies, you know the most important requirement for any international initiative. We are gradually now moving from multilateralism to plurilateralism, where groupings, networks are more important. The most important qualification or need for legitimacy is that grouping must be representative. That is very important for any grouping to be accepted, be effective, that it must be representative. Now you may have noticed that for several years, Indian Prime Minister gets invited to G7 meetings. Now G7 countries put together are nearly half the size of India's population. That means we are also gradually shifting from sovereign equality to appreciating citizens and people that live in each of the nations. The flip side of the story could be why Turkey is not allowed to join European Union, because in European Parliament the number of representatives that Turkey might send potentially could destabilize the situation for European nations. So there's a flip side as well. And therefore the first fundamental qualification that makes India unique, and you possibly have made the guess, is that India today is being projected as world's largest population country. That means any grouping that has India on board has 1.4 plus billion people being represented in that grouping at international level. It is important to have projection, but because we are here among scholars of international relations, we need to look at the nuanced reality of that projection. For example, first of all, given the pandemic, many countries, including India, could not hold census. Many countries do every 10 years, every decade they do census. And most of the government policies, projects are based on the statistics produced in the census. So India couldn't do its own census. Many other countries, China also could not do its own census. So this whole projection of India being world's largest population country is based on United Nations population division. Not even these countries, United Nations population division making a projection in April this year that by June India would have crossed China, and in June we did cross China according to those projections. All of you also know China peaked its population rise last year at 1.426 billion people. It's now come down to 1.425, and India in June has crossed to become 1.426 billion people in India according to projections. That means India's population as per June, depending on United Nations population division projections, has increased compared to China by about 2.9 million. That's point number one. It's based on projections. And projections are very significant in international relations or in bilateral relations, everyday relations. Second important element is more complex. These projections, given the history of China, are based only on population of mainland China. These projections do not include Hong Kong and Macau, because historically Hong Kong was separate and they had their own census. They have in fact their own flag, currency, police and so on. So if you were to add about 7.4 million people of Hong Kong, remember the difference that India has made is 2.5 million. Hong Kong alone is 7.4 million. If you add Macau, 0.7 billion, 7 lakh, 7 lakh. Chinese would also perhaps like you to add on Taiwan, 24 million. So while it is interesting to see projections, it is important to understand what lies beneath. But what is reality which makes India still very attractive is demographics. Within that population, we talk of demographic dividend. Prime Minister often talks of demographic and democratic dividend of India. India's median age now is about little over 28 years, compared to China's being estimated at 39, 10 years older. United States 38 years because immigrants make that population younger. Which means the potential for growth, or as we say in population studies, replacement ratio. Replacement ratio of India is going to increase over a period of time, and therefore India will continue to be largest population country on the world, and more the world becomes conscious of listening to human beings, citizens, the more clout, more credibility will come upon India, and therefore to make an institution representative, my first point, India is a unique actor. Second point in determining what makes India unique is history. This population has had thousands of years of history. one of the rare continuing civilization state. And that brings in a lot of wisdom but also baggage. For example, the logo itself talks about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and there are a lot of debates as to from where it comes. Is it Tamil Sangam literature? Is it Upanishads? Is it Dalit literature? But nevertheless, it comes from the composite culture of this country. And that sense of a global vision, I hope I am not jingoistic when I say, doesn't exist in many societies. The greatest power on earth, for example, with United States that we are all fond of discussing, was known for first 50 years of last century for isolationism as a favored policy. They wanted to not intervene, not get engaged with global affairs. Now look at the sentiment that Indian civilization has had of always having had global vision. So when we got independence in middle of very violent partition, about 500 plus principalities hanging loose around 2 dominion states, we were in chaos. But constitution makers, the founding fathers, placed a Article 51 in our constitution saying that the successive generations of Indian elite, political leadership, will work for global peace for the sake of human race, not even nations. That kind of vision, collective vision of this civilizational state, is again something that places us apart, and therefore despite having all the limitations, from the very beginning this country was very active in international affairs, very active in all international organizations. Some of the more capable countries were not as active in international affairs. And allow me to say that very often India was not heard very clearly. Prime Minister Nehru used to write long letters to these great leaders that this is how we need to organize global governance, but not really got the attention that maybe now increasingly India is receiving. But the tradition of global vision, that is unique again to this country, and I think we need to appreciate that part that makes our presidency of G20 unusual compared to others. Now this enormous, humongous population and enormously large tradition of this country result in certain amount of productivity, whether it is intellectual productivity or it is physical productivity. And you're all hearing the buzzword now that India is already the 5th largest economy, soon to be 3rd largest economy. Now, we are talking here of G20, which is a group of top 20 economies, and we are talking here of an economy which is almost shooting upwards like none other. Obviously, India is the fastest growing economy among G20. But again, have a nuanced picture of that growth rate. India is projected to grow at 7.2%. Most estimates that it will grow at 6%. Another country next door, equally large population, in fact China-India population put together is how much? 2.8 billion people. The next largest country, United States, is 1/3 or 1/4 actually, 1/4 of either China or India. So in population terms, you have to understand the demographics are very interesting, but we are talking of economics. China is projected officially to grow at 5.2% according to the government estimates, targets. Most estimates say it will grow about 4%. United States is growing at 1.8%. So China, 19 plus trillion economy, growing at even 4% is enormously impressive. Only difference is that because Chinese economy is so deeply tied down with the rest of the world, most of the nations have China, 128 nations have China as the largest trading partner, and if it slows down even from 6 to 4%, there is going to be impact on all those countries as well, not only on China. But nevertheless, 4% growth for a 19 trillion economy is not bad, compared to 1.8% growth rate for a 24 trillion economy, United States. So they have their own equations. And then comes India, which is growing at 7.2% target, hopefully 6%. Now, if you look at, for example, the speech yesterday evening in Johannesburg that Prime Minister gave, he talked of India becoming the growth engine of global economy. China was the engine of growth for many years. Now India is beginning to be seen as engine of growth, because growth rates determine how much FDI will come in that country, because per dollar returns have to be interesting. So we are now becoming extremely attractive target for foreign direct investment. So again, current equations may be complex, but there is again a clear indication of India emerging as a very attractive destination for investments, as a fastest growing economy, country of young people, at least for next 30 years, who are restless and want to do something unusual. I just spoke to a student, he said, I want to do something unusual, tell me what can I do. I just in my room had a conversation. So that kind of economic potential of this country again makes India perhaps an ideal candidate to be holding the presidency of G20 in such complex circumstances. Fourth element again is very interesting: political stability. No one in the world doubts that India's political stability can come under question. And I'm not just talking of 9 years. I'm talking of entire history of post-independence India. You just look around other countries that became independent along with India as to what has happened to them. Military dictatorships, military coups, all kinds of political upheavals, insurgencies. You can imagine countries around yourself. With all the challenges, India's democracy, and that goes back to the, I think, common Indian citizens' DNA. Indian citizens are relatively far more politically conscious than in several other countries. You could sometimes find us being too politically entrenched in our conversations. For example, our cartoons are very often about politics. Look at newspapers of some other countries, not necessarily cartoons are about only politics every morning. So, common man of this country who goes, 800 million plus people go to vote on general elections. India is perennially on some kind of other elections. That ensures political stability of this country. So even when India had 24 party coalitions, no one doubted the government to fall mid-term. That political stability is unusual and becomes a great attraction as to the mandate that G20 brings on India for its presidency, and how longevity of political elite in power will ensure that decisions taken, consensus built, notes shared will be carried forward and implemented over a period of time is very significant. And I think therefore political stability in India is again something very interesting, particularly when we talk of so much instability around the world. Now let me move to operations and processes from 5 determinants. What are those operations that we are talking about? Let me continue from the last point I made, and I think one thing visible in that political stability and robustness is unusual shift, and all of you have, I'm sure, noticed in foreign policy of India. We are almost in a next stage of foreign policy in terms of both in India becoming increasingly assertive, but India's diplomatic footwork also becoming extremely hyperactive, starting from Prime Minister himself. The hyperactive diplomacy and assertive tone of foreign policy is very visible, and it is being increasingly recognized even at the level of discomfort by several countries. You have heard several speeches that Foreign Minister Jaishankar has made, the way he speaks. Advantage is that he spent 38 years in diplomacy, so he doesn't need any notes. He knows half the world on first name basis in diplomatic circles. That has an advantage. But more than our foreign minister, Prime Minister himself is an iconic figure for foreign policy itself. We are also in a world of summit diplomacy where national leaders decide much part of the diplomacy and rest of the elite basically implements those decisions. And we can all praise our Prime Minister, but let me just give you facts and figures. Several agencies, not Indian, outside, have repeatedly come about with assessments of him being an important leader. There is an agency called Morning Consult, which last 2 years was doing surveys on 22 top leaders around the world, and for a second time again, the agency came to an assessment that Indian Prime Minister, with voting of 76%, was the most popular leader in the world today. Now, you may disagree in terms of how much credibility it means or results to, how much efficacy in that leadership could result into, but perhaps we cannot contest the visibility. The visibility of Indian leadership and India, and how enthusiastically Indian diaspora engages when Indian leaders go abroad. That visibility definitely is different, and that is noticed by G20 leaders when they engage India. And that again makes India an unusual presidency for G20. Now, what it means for actual day-to-day mundane affairs of G20? Something more simple that again you know, this G20 has been the largest exercise ever in the history of G20. You obviously know that we already have held 120 meetings in 57 cities, 60 cities are identified, so each city has had multiple meetings. So much so, you travel to any airport these days in India, you see it decorated with G20 banners, designs, whole, not just airports, the city itself is completely decorated. That kind of enormous, to give you an example, the last summit meeting happened in Indonesia, and Indonesia used about, I think at best 20 cities to organize various meetings. And in India case, almost 120 meetings in 60 cities is the largest exercise that has happened. Again, very unique. Somebody will have to now, match up to the bar that is raised now by India as to how G20 meetings have to be organized. As a result, because we have so many destinations, so many meetings, we also have large number of people joining these meetings. For example, there is a category called officially engaged groups. G20 has, for example, Business 20, Women 20, Think Tank 20, Youth 20, Civil Society 20, all kinds of 20. They are officially engaged groups. To give you one example, the Civil Society 20, which had a meeting in Jaipur, has 16 working groups under it. And that is true of all other groups as well. So imagine how many people are getting officially engaged in doing things, in taking the agenda of G20 forward. More interesting, each of these meetings, according to G20 tradition, work under Trioca leadership. So the last country which was holding presidency, the host country, and the next country to host, on every level, whether it is a subgroup, working group, or T20 or S20, or ministerial meeting, or any meeting, will be 3 people together chairing that meeting. Last country, Indonesia, India, and Brazil. So now look at the number of people who are getting engaged, number of people who are visiting India, and most important result, the voluminous number of recommendations that they are producing. We are aware that 59 themes are there on which broadly consensus has been evolved. But imagine the voluminous number of reports and recommendations that are emerging out of these large number of meetings. That again sets a bar very high and is unusual, is unique that any such large number of recommendations were ever produced before or after. The fourth unique distinction of India then is that last year, for example, the summit meeting happened about 15 days before Indonesia was demitting the presidency. Before that, in Italy, there was about 4 weeks' time when the summit conference happened. Thank you. Summit conference happened and the host country was demitting presidency. In India's case, summit meeting is happening 81 days before India will demit the presidency. That means India will still be holding presidency as the beginning of implementation of decisions that are made in the summit meeting carry forward. And then of course for the whole next year, given the triacos structure, India will again be part and parcel of whatever G20 and other subgroups will do over a period of time. Fifth and last part of operations and processes which are unique here is this whole Indian tradition of, as I said, elections. India is perennially on elections. And that has made this whole exercise of G20 in 60 cities repeatedly, I said multiple meetings in most of the cities, almost like a national festival. The connectivity that common man has with something called G20 has not happened anywhere before. So let me hazard a guess that G20 exercise, which is a year-long exercise, can already be described as a success story as far as domestic politics is concerned. Now, the foreign policy component of India hosting G20, we know that certain amount of consensus is evolved already. We've also seen challenges that some of the meetings had faced in coming about with their final declaration. But that the foreign policy component success or how much success, we'll have to wait until the summit meeting happens. We know what transpired and what has come out of it. Now, when we talk of what has come out of it, I will talk about three unique things about outcomes that we anticipate to happen. I should be careful. When we talk about likely outcomes that we might see and what is going to be unique in those outcomes, given the fact that it has been an exercise which is like a juggernaut, the whole billion people are being kind of made aware of. I think 1 million people are being made to engage with these things that are happening on the ground, whether it is somebody who's setting the tents and bringing the mics for various meetings around the country. This has resulted definitely in giving India a unique opportunity to host an unusual meeting of heads of state of this kind, wakes up the whole country in several ways. So to the minimum and mundane level, you will notice a very visible transformation and creation of physical, institutional and social infrastructure, which is largely geared towards supporting India as an emerging country, as an emerging power. I was shy of saying, because India is looking at much more in terms of wielding influence rather than wielding power. So you have this whole consciousness and physical, institutional. You are aware of 100 universities being connected into this whole exercise, which is not even part of the what I call officially engaged groups. So there are so many other things happening which are not so visible in terms of being driven by G20, but they are still connected to G20. So enormous amount of gearing up of a certain part of your population, including people sitting in this room, visualizing India playing a very different role in global affairs in coming times. How to strengthen that vision, how to strengthen that commitment, that conviction of Indian voters, Indian democracy, to support that kind of engagement. But in more concrete terms, for example, this also gave opportunity for India in all those meetings, very unique opportunity to bring in sports people, academics, business people, advisors, officials, ministers, all kinds of people are coming to join these meetings to showcase India's culture, India's hospitality, India's flora, fauna, to these people who otherwise may not have been exposed to this. But also, if you don't condemn me for now speaking the official language, project India's development schemes and projects as to what has India done in terms of showcasing the success stories at various levels in multiple sectors, thereby making the international community far more interested in engaging India. So it is a unique opportunity for India to catapult or leapfrog using this opportunity. You have repeatedly heard of G20 today accounting together for 80% of global GDP, 75% of global trade, two-thirds of global population. Now, here is an opportunity to chair those meetings and engage their attention to who we are and what we think we want to do and what is our leverages and potential. Makes it very unusual and unique opportunity for India. But India in return also wants to do something unique for G20 in terms of outcomes at two levels. One, in terms of in what direction the future trajectories of G20 are likely to go. India's presidency has clearly shifted focus to global south. It is not an exclusive club of G20 nations looking for their own profitability. The whole discourse is shifting from growth rates to development. Whether you look at environment, you look at poverty alleviation, you look at any of the issues that terrorism that G20 is dealing, now the lens is being recrafted, recalibrated, including small island states, for example. Countries that are apparently on the periphery, and I think that again is in India's DNA, the way we develop non-alignment, that we want to stand with the people on the margins, people in the periphery. You can invoke Gandhi for that, who said the future generation of India should make policies thinking of the last man in the line. That is in civilizational DNA, and therefore Indian presidency is likely, and I said this is unique possibility of India's presidency, likely to change the trajectories and focus of future G20 to engage much more and listen much more to global south voices and their concerns. For example, debt crisis could be one important concern. Just like the focus is likely to change with India's presidency in terms of making that unique contribution, India also wants to tinker with the structure of G20. G20 today constitutes of 19 largest economies of the world plus European Union. India is fully aware, like many other countries, that future of the world is going to be decided in second half of this century by Africa. That is where the demographic and development trajectories are going to transform most rapidly in Africa. And therefore, Indian Prime Minister, Indian government is proposing to make African Union as the 21st member of G20. So G20 structure might be different as it moves from India to Brazil. It could have 21 members rather than G20. We'll talk of G21. And it is very much out of consciousness of where, in fact, we keep hearing very interesting figures of trillions of dollars. I think the highest estimate, which is difficult to believe, is $300+ trillion in next 10 years are going to be available in developed world to be invested in least developed and developing countries. Now, this may look very ambitious figure, but developed countries have a limitation how much investment can be done in those countries, and therefore, if you are looking at per dollar returns better, profitability and commercial viability to be better, then you have to obviously invest in countries which are developing rapidly and even least developed countries, because they are going to go up much faster. And that kind of transformation could be facilitated or even accelerated by G20 becoming G21 and G21 engaging global south much more seriously than it has done before. Now, final segment of my discussion is what are the unique limitations. There are also unique limitations other than I spoke of determinants, process and operations which are unique, and of course I anticipated some outcomes to be unique. Now, what are those unique limitations that India again has and will have to deal with? Again, I am not bringing knowledge out of some hidden space. You are all aware of these things. I am only putting them in a certain frame. As I always say, it is how do you organize the furniture in room that tells you whether it is a lecture theatre or it is a round table conference. So you know these facts. When we talk of G20 global top 20 economies, these are unusually top heavy. if you want to describe it in that sense. The two big economies, United States and China, put together are larger than 2.5 times compared to 18 of the rest put together. 2.5 times larger than the 18 of the rest put together. That means that these two economies have unusual advantage in steering the course as to how global economy will move in future. They have unusual leverages. And we are all aware that they are at loggerheads with each other. From President Trump times, we are hearing of trade and technology wars, tariff wars, semiconductors being denied to China by United States. Biden administration took a very harsh position saying that anyone, even US citizen having anything to do with Chinese semiconductor industries should resign within 24 hours. Which is of course understandable because United States would not like to see China's economy crossing GDP in total number. But if you look at per capita, again very interesting. There are layers and there are onion-like layers and layers of how you see reality, and I understand that scholars like you are fully aware of those layers. United States per capita income, all of you know, I am just bringing on the table, $80,000. China is $13,200. You are already reminded of India, right? $2,600 per year. Total GDP figures are interesting, but then how do you look at per capita incomes? Again, then you could look at how skewed the division is. How much of the national resources are occupied by a limited number of people in each of these countries. That problem is in all countries, including United States, China and India. I am not saying any country is again unique. We are not unique in that sense. So these two countries in command of, as I said, 2.5 times of global GDP compared to the 18 put together, if they do not wish some initiatives of India to move forward, that will be definitely the strongest limitation that India will face. We are reading in newspapers today, President Biden is arriving 2 days before. He is arriving in Delhi on 7th of September and will stay till 10th of this September, and which is a good sign that he is spending more time, not like 4 hours. Sometimes leaders have also spent 6 hours in this country. I don't want to name right now. Second bigger limitation, I think all of us again know, is Ukraine war. And Ukraine war has shown impact in several of the ministerial meetings that have happened already, where we could not come about with a clear declaration at end of that ministerial meeting. You are aware, so I am not listing them. Ukraine war could create serious limitations, and that could happen primarily because India is not Indonesia. India has a strong economic relationship with both United States and China. Very often either China is India's largest trading partner or United States is largest trading partner. I think this year we are counting $128 billion of bilateral trade with China. Of course, China's trade is one-sided largely. India's trade with United States is much balanced, very often in India's favor. So again, nuances are interesting to see. But India is not Indonesia, because Indonesia was not seen as a country that both United States and China were trying to pull, expecting that country to join my bandwagon. Whereas India is being sought after to be falling in line with either American position or Chinese position. Both of them know India will not, and they are reluctantly accepting that reality. So that might again be a limitation which could erupt and disrupt, or whatever way you want to look at it. Unique because India could have been the president 3 years ago, before Italy, before Indonesia. But India chose this year, and by now Ukraine crisis have continued. That limitation can also be understood internally, the way India's position has changed on Ukraine over a period of time. We began in United Nations talking about India being concerned. You have to just read various speeches and do semantic analysis, content analysis. Next word we used is we regret. Next word we used, we condemn. In diplomacy, words are very significant. So this is after a lot of debate, these choice of words is done. Anyway, let me fast forward, and when Boka massacre happened, India went to the extent of saying we condemn it and we asked for an independent investigation of what has happened in Boka. Then in September last year, you saw Prime Minister telling President Putin, this era is not era of war, which became a buzzword. Half a dozen global leaders used that in their speeches. Bali declaration had that expression in the final declaration. In Hiroshima, Indian Prime Minister went still a step ahead and said territorial integrity of countries must be respected. That means this is a reflection of limitation of India is maneuvering within that bandwidth of neutrality. Has not condemned Russia as of now because we don't want to ditch Russia. Russia will go into the pocket of Chinese immediately, which is counterproductive. We can't afford that. Plus we are getting cheap oil, which is good for us. Europeans are buying after we refine it, we are making some money out of it. But that limitation is visible in multiple ways, both internally how Indian foreign policy is conducting response to Ukraine and how Ukraine crisis have impacted upon multiple meetings that have happened in last 8 months. And you are aware of what has happened in those things. Final unique limitation again is India-China tensions. You are reading in newspapers every day. Last ditch efforts being made as to how we can find out some kind of disengagement. We had a 19th round of Corps Commanders meeting on 13-14 followed by 18-19 meeting of Major Generals in Chushul and Demchok, I think, if I am right. Trying to find out some kind of limited disengagement so that it looks like border is finally resolved, can open possibilities of President Xi coming to India. Indian Prime Minister is going to have a meeting with President Xi Jinping in Johannesburg. India-China tensions also are happening at such a time that Galwan not only happened, tensions have continued for 3 years, which again is a sequence. In 2012-13, crisis happened, eyeball to eyeball forces came for a week, then another place for 3 weeks, then you remember Doklam for 10 weeks, now Galwan for 3 years. So over a period of time, this relationship has also been getting much more complicated. And again, at this stage, India chooses to be holding the presidency of G20. China alone, remember, is equal to rest of the G20 GDP put together minus United States. China alone, GDP is equal to rest of the G20 put together minus United States. So it's a powerful player in that sense. And if it is at loggerheads or angry, uncomfortable, unhappy with the host country, that could throw up its own challenges in that sense. Now that again throws up enormous opportunities for India's diplomacy to show that finesse, how it is able to put things in place in last minute. As the Chinese say, every challenge comes with an opportunity. And that is my last point, I think, that is a unique possibility of how India will be able to perhaps convert challenges into opportunities and catapult itself as a country which will be seen differently post G20 summit than how was it seen pre G20 summit meeting. And with that hope and optimism, let me close here and I look forward if there are any comments and questions. Thank you. Back to Samir.
Thank you, Professor Swaran Singh. As usual, you have given us new frames from commonly known facts.
45 minutes.
You have very brilliantly touched upon the Indian DNA to lead with a global vision. You have touched upon, you have very quintessentially put it, the connections that India is putting that transcends from global community to common man on streets. I'm sure we are all stimulated and our worldview has definitely changed, become much more brighter, and it has definitely whetted our appetite to know more from you. So may I invite questions from faculty and students who are here.
That should be my question to you. I really hope President Putin comes to the G20 meeting. and I think India is working hard to make sure that happens. But more interesting question on what kind of multilateralism India is trying to pursue and develop. Before I give you what you already know, the buzzwords, I want to take you backwards. Composite of culture of India is inherently a culture that celebrates diversity. You've heard slogans like unity in diversity. That's not just a shallow slogan, that's our DNA. India is a country where you are perfectly at home seeing people next to you on the same table, either talking different languages or eating different food or wearing different dresses. It does not even come to your notice. So you are so much at home with plurality, with multiplicity, whether it is ethnicity based, language based, religion based, culture based, food based, dress based, anything. So that is first point I want to underline, that unlike many other countries that are relatively homogeneous, India is perfectly at home with whatever you call it, minilateralism, multilateralism, multipolarism, and the buzzword today, plurilateralism. India is pushing for plurilateralism increasingly because India, and I think most academics, including me, believe plurilateralism is the way forward, is the way for 21st century. What is plurilateralism compared to minilateralism, multilateralism, multipolarism? Just one line for each. Minilateralism usually is a limited number of people with a fixed limited objective, driven sometime by a party from outside, like six-party talks. Multipolarism clearly is power driven. It is determined by who is powerful, and there could be multipoles in an international system. Multilateralism focuses more on sovereign equality, on institutionalism, on norms, on legal framework. Plurilateralism is interesting because it thrives on flexibility, where members can come together on an overarching theme that this is an area we need to work, and then go into silos of their subdivisions, where limited number of subgroups of within that overarching group can focus on certain issue areas, step in, step outside whenever they wish, whenever they think it is necessary. So flexibility underlines plurilateralism, and that is what India is increasingly focusing on, building pluralistic and plurilateral kind of multilateralism, where you can accommodate all kinds of actors. I was attending a conference recently on blue economy, and the participant from Maldives said Maldives should be described not just as a small state but as a micro state. And that triggered a thought in my mind that we are here discussing blue economy, and Maldives should be the pioneering and leading country to teach everybody else how to deal with blue economy. So given the context, the leverages of member nations change, and if any multilateral organization has that flexibility to accommodate that, then that will perhaps be far more effective and agile to deal with changes. Why are we not able to change United Nations today? Because it is not agile, it is not flexible, it is not possible to tinker with it very easily. In a different era, that was important because there was too much tinkering happening at that time and you wanted to bring stability. And now we want to ensure that there is little more space in terms of maneuvering for different actors, and therefore plurilateralism is how we are pushing. And that is why when India goes to, whether it is Quad or it is BRICS or it is Shanghai Cooperation Organization, any of these things, India pursues these organizations from this perspective of flexibility and plurality being appreciated. So when, for example, BRICS created a new development bank, they didn't call it BRICS Development Bank. They knew BRICS will not stay as the name forever. They are soon going to have maybe 3 or 5 more nations. Obviously, either you have to put all the alphabet into it and difficult to remember, or you have to give it a new name. So they called it New Development Bank. And the entire flexibility of using local currencies and so on is a space where things are not cut and dried so hard that you cannot easily change things. And that is the kind of multilateralism I think India is pursuing. I hope I was able to answer your question. Otherwise, we are next to each other. We can have a bilateral also. Thank you for your comment and question. But I will ask you about Putin. I will ask you later about Putin, whether President Putin is coming or not, because he knows more about that than I do. Okay.
Good evening, Professor. My name is Rahul. I am pursuing a master's in international studies. So you talk in the length about India's uniqueness when it comes to G20 presidency. But my question is, does G20 presidency provides India an opportunity to correct the anomalies that usually go against the third world countries when it comes to food and agricultural subsidies?
Thank you. I think that's a very important question he's raised, because there is increasingly pressure on reducing, cutting, removing subsidies in making the trade more fair and equitable, etc. That does not very often take into account of some of the countries where subsidies are still important, are required to make them competitive. India very often does not join some of these multilateral organizations like RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, because India wanted to protect its micro, medium and small industries. So India is conscious of not just its own sectors where protection and subsidies will be required, but is also aware likewise that in several other countries that kind of arrangement will be required. But at the same time, India is pursuing that in developed countries, including now China, for example, whether when you have a certain level of development already achieved in certain countries, should you then continue to provide subsidies? Should you treat all in one basket? For example, in environment, we talk about CBDR, where differential responsibilities have to be understood. So subsidies also in that sense, India is a votary of certain sectors, certain countries need that support system, whereas in developed countries subsidies should go. So that voice is already being promoted, but whether that voice is effective, that is something that so far is a half glass full, is an optimistic assessment. But that is again is an important question for G20 to address as to how it wants to deal with the subsidies which should actually empower some of the relatively vulnerable sectors and sections, but actually end up making them more vulnerable because subsidies, when they go and happen in developed countries, those become unusually advantaged and almost destroy. For example, Amul milk had a big issue with Australian milk and milk products coming in RCEP. Similar issues happen on everyday basis. Largely India raises that voice. I am not saying that India is able to dictate that issue as of now.
Yeah.
So my only question is that what India is actually doing to tackle climate change during this G20 presidency, and what more can be done?
Climate change clearly is a very significant, there is a subgroup on environment itself. In fact, in several other officially engaged groups that I mentioned, Science 20, Youth 20 and all, there is an element of climate placed in each of these separately. So climate is always, for example, I was mentioning of the meeting that happened in Jaipur of Civil Society 20. There was a subgroup on, there was a working group on LIFE, which is Prime Minister's initiative, Lifestyle for Environment, LIFE. There was also a subgroup on SEVA, which again had a climate component as to how mitigation can happen using traditional techniques. So environment has been brought into all various meetings at all levels. Now, how much we are able to transform that into actual action or even decision making is complex, because world has already moved now to INDCs, which nations decide independently what are their internally determined targets for carbon emissions. So the larger picture of climate change in COP27 itself is not how originally India was engaging with that. India to begin with was talking of per capita emissions. India was supporting CBDR. That I think has, climate justice is again an important question now in that. G20 will be working within the larger framework of where COP27 exists. It cannot go a step beyond that. But at the national level, again, I think India has placed very clearly targets of 2070 of being a carbon neutral country. By 2030, 30% of energy should be from renewables. I hear that automobiles based on diesel and petrol will stop production from 2027. So there are hard and tough decisions that India is making on its own, and that should perhaps bring certain credibility to India when India wants to push certain ideas at a G20 level. Environment is very significant issue for India, and India has been pursuing that both in terms of showcasing the practice and also arguing the case with developed countries.
Good evening, sir. My name is Aniket Kumar. You said this G20 success story has been G20 has been success story for domestic policy as concerned, but as from the opposite side, can the rising domestic challenges can create or have a negative influence on its presidency, or what effects does it will have on the rising domestic challenges will have on the G20 presidency of India?
Okay. Thank you. Because when I said that in my assessment, the domestic impact of G20 activities throughout last 8 months can already be seen as a success, because we have not heard of any flip-flops, no major flip-flops. Maybe one meeting in Kashmir, some couple of countries did not join. Otherwise, all these meetings have happened as they should have happened. In some of the meetings, final declaration could not come about. But the fact that I, in a lighter vein, said it is like a national festival. If the national festival has gone fantastic and fine, there are always going to be some hiccups, but marginal, minor hiccups. So in terms of building infrastructure, in terms of building that consciousness, to me most important is the increasing consciousness of common citizens as to what India is doing, what India can do, what India should do beyond its own boundaries. See, even Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru used to go to villages and address simple people about non-alignment. He believed even if they don't right now understand what it means, I still want to make them hear me, I still want to take some feedback as to what common Indians think India is doing. He used to also say foreign policy is only an extension of domestic politics. So in that sense, if you can rejuvenate and create a certain consciousness at national level of common people, of what is India capable of doing at global level and what will accrue from that engagement of India to Indian citizens. The enthusiasm that you see of Indian diaspora now when Indian leaders go abroad is very different. I mean, we can take almost without any, hesitation, certain amount of pride that President Biden asked Prime Minister Modi in Hiroshima G7 summit that I want to take your autograph. And he said, this is because I am inundated with requests to join the dinner which I am hosting for you in White House. And we saw what happened in front of White House. Even for US presidents, such crowds on White House have not come chanting their names like this. Or in Australia, for example, Anthony Albanese, he says, Modi is my boss. I mean, I don't want to caricature things, but that kind of consciousness of common man of what India can deliver at the global level and what connection exists in India doing those things in return for India's own prosperity, on security, on peace. That consciousness is what I was indicating when I said the positive impact of G20 meetings in 60 cities. The domestic component of that, I think I used the word for domestic politics component of it, that is already a certain amount of success one can identify. Now the foreign policy part of challenge still remains, because we'll have to see how all the 20 leaders sit together and come to a certain understanding, build consensus. How much of consensus is built on how many issues, that is yet to be seen. And I said that could be an opportunity for Indian diplomacy to showcase that finesse to put things in place at last minute, as I said. So that is what I meant, that domestic component also needs to be appreciated. It's not like people are sitting in closed door meetings and you don't know anything other than some elite that reads English newspapers and reads headlines there. How common people on the street, as I gave the example of even people who are providing crockery and tents for these meetings, they also become conscious of what is happening. Why there are 4 meetings in Goa, 3 meetings in Gandhinagar. That consciousness of, it's like if you talk to an American citizen, his consciousness and his confidence, his behavior is very different, because American citizens think they are citizens of a global power, and their behavior is very different. And therefore, when India is emerging, India's citizens should also showcase a very different behavior. We are not less in terms of knowledge, we are much less in terms of confidence in average citizen. For example, when I see some people of India in international airports, they sometimes appear less confident, little anxiety prone. You may not see that very often in case of American citizens. They think somebody will come to protect me if something happens to me. Now, Indian citizens increasingly are beginning to feel that India will also come to protect. You see how rescue has happened in several crises in Gulf, or more recently in Ukraine. That kind of consciousness of common citizens of India becoming a global power will again showcase then how they vote in elections, who they support, on what issues they support, who do they support. And that is significant connect of domestic politics and foreign policy, which I thought that connect is being reinforced and strengthened by so many meetings happening in so many cities under G20. Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I often I'm asked this question. First thing, remember, India is not China. That is the premise you should begin with. And therefore, India should not, will not, cannot do what China does. India has its own leverages. In fact, so many countries want to cultivate friendship with India because they don't like China. So there is a added spin-off advantage that comes out of China being what China is. China has built $1.5 trillion worth of projects under BRI around the world. India cannot do that. I mean, we only have $3.5 trillion economy. But India's soft power, as you mentioned, education, movies, culture, democracy, politics, foreign policy, that becomes much more influential and powerful compared to China. India, I often say, is much more acceptable to people on the street, and China is much more acceptable to people who are sitting in boardrooms. There is an engagement of regime to regime, and there is an engagement of people to people. Now we have to choose which is our strength. Our strength is to build bridges from people to people. And that is how India is perceived around the world. India also, you see, increasingly is becoming visible in terms of professionals of India being visible in NASA. Somebody said 37% are Indian origin. Or in several, in fact, interesting to see that in United Nations 15 agencies, 4 are today occupied by Chinese. So wherever you have this influence of the veto power, United Nations Security Council, Chinese have advantage. But when you look at open market, much of the CEOs are Indian ethnic origin. So India's visibility in very different sense is emerging. And very quick last point, I know she's getting conscious of me closing now. You look at how India is engaging in foreign policy. India is focusing on transparency, on standardization, on quality control, in terms of even economic partnerships of investment. So it's not just money. Second, India is also building partnerships by showcasing, engaging, influencing, building bridges using culture. You see, you just take note of where Indian Prime Minister goes, what places he visits. culture and diaspora have become two very strong points of India's engagement abroad in pushing forward its foreign policy. Overseas Chinese, yes, they have invested into China because they had money, they want to bring that money back in China. But I don't think, and I may be daring a guess here, that Chinese citizens are seen as ambassadors of China as much Indian citizens are seen as ambassadors of India abroad. So use of connections with India's diaspora, use of India's culture is increasingly becoming a very integral component of how Indian foreign policy is being promoted, and that places us very differently. Look at immediate neighborhood of India, for example. India has showcased that our culture connect with India and neighborhood is much stronger than that of China. China is only coming there for commercial enterprises, profit making. And when push comes to shove, you see in Sri Lanka, even before IMF could vouch that we will come to support, India has committed $4 billion in Sri Lanka. They have learned lessons of where is China. So when it comes to really taking hard decisions, India also brings in hard cash. But that is not our strength. So we want to combine with multiple spectrum of elements that we have as our strength and put that together and push our foreign policy forward. And therefore, I want to close again by saying that the most important thing for all of us, not just the foreign policy makers, we all have stakes in foreign policy, is to understand and appreciate what are India's quintessential leverages in emerging as a global player. I'm not even saying leader. As a global player, to wield influence, to contribute India's wisdom into global governance. With that, I will stop here and back to Samina.
Thank you. I don't want to come in between you and the student. You're such a crowd puller. My job there is done, so you can, it's your free time as long as you're ready to interact. So if you have any more questions, you can take. That's not an issue.
Okay, I think they are also tired and they want a cup of tea now.
Maybe now you have prompted me to put a question. You have
Please.
identified few limitations.
Yes.
Vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Ukraine war. What is your suggestion? How could it be best, navigated?
I think the best strength of any diplomacy is personal connections. Personal connections and communications are the core strength of any country's diplomacy. That results in personal chemistry and leads to concessions and accommodation. I am being almost telegraphic as I say, we deliver full lectures on these things. Advantage that India today has in overcoming limitation is that both the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister are extremely articulate. Prime Minister particularly is very effective in making personal connections, and that I think should help us. Even when he is in BRICS meeting, his mind is on G20. In fact, all BRICS nations are part of G20, and every G20 meeting also has a mini BRICS summit. So BRICS in Johannesburg will be followed by a BRICS in New Delhi again. It is every time that it happens, it's called mini BRICS in G20. So that personal connect advantage of the Prime Minister, the oration advantage of the Prime Minister, the hyperactive footwork that he likes to do, I think those are our advantages. And we possibly are putting those leverages of India to full use to see that some of these limitations can overcome. But just like India has advantages, other leaders too have their advantages, and it's a contest between two titans in that sense. I mean, we are talking of several leaders who are also not novice or innocent, they are also masters in their own politics and diplomacy. So India will put forward its own strengths and try to see how best we can achieve. First of all, to make sure that all the 20 national leaders are able to sit together. And then if that happens, then of course we'll try to see that maximum themes are put on the final declaration with a consensus built on most of these. But there will always be issues where you will have either the footnotes added or paragraphs eliminated at last minute. And that is where you see parts of Delhi will be completely closed for those 3 days. And for these 3 days, I think you will see hundreds of people working behind scenes will not sleep for 72 hours.